This video will provide an overview of the cardiovascular system, which is composed of your heart, the blood it pumps, and the blood vessels that the blood travels through. The cardiovascular system is the transportation system for your body. It carries a variety of things. It carries oxygen, of course, to your cells so that ATP can be produced through cellular respiration. The nutrients that have been absorbed from food are also carried, along with the various cells of the immune system and hormones that are sending messages to the cells of your body. The cardiovascular system is also involved in removing the waste products that we need to get out of the cells. Even though I call it cardiovascular, circulatory system is another common name for it. There are three main parts or three components to your cardiovascular system. First of all, there is your heart, which is the cardio part of that word. And the heart is basically a fist-size pump that moves the blood. The heart contracts many billion times in the average lifespan, and the cells in the heart are full of mitochondria so that they constantly have a supply of the ATP that they need to keep contracting. Then you have the blood vessels. So blood vessels are basically tubes that have smooth muscle in them that carry the blood around the body. Basically, we divide blood vessels into arteries, which carry blood away from the heart, veins, which carry blood back to the heart, and capillaries, the smallest of blood vessels, where all the action happens. If we were to take all the blood vessels in your body and put them end to end, they are approximately 62,000 miles long, which would go almost 3 times around the equator. The capillaries are so abundant that they touch nearly every cell in your body. Not the cells in your lens of your eye, for example, don't have capillaries, but nearly every other cell is right next door to a capillary. So you are full of blood vessels. And then the last component of your cardiovascular system is blood, which is composed of plasma and red and white blood cells and platelets and many other things that are dissolved in the blood. The typical adult has somewhere between 5 to 7 liters of blood in their body, which is around 9 to 12 pints, or if you want to think in gallons, there'd be 8 pints in a gallon. The total volume of blood in your body makes it all the way through about once a minute. So your heart is really pretty busy moving that blood around, pumping it through every day of your life. So let's start with the heart. It has 4 chambers, which means it has 4 rooms, and it's sort of cone-shaped. It lies inside your thoracic cavity, above your diaphragm, and between the uppermost part of it is about the 2nd rib down, and the bottommost part is the 5th rib. So in this diagram, we can see the heart just sort of sitting here underneath the sternum, underneath the breastbone, slightly to the left, and as kind of a cone shape. There's sort of a point here down at the bottom that's pointing off towards the left hip. The blood enters the heart in the upper chambers, which are known as atria for plural, or atrium if you're just talking about one of them, and then is pumped out of the heart from the lower chambers, which are called ventricles. In order to prevent blood from not going where it is not supposed to go, to keep it from going backwards, there are actually valves, there are shut-off valves inside the heart that make sure that the blood always goes in the right direction. So here we have a diagram of a heart with some of the parts labeled, and this would be as if you were a doctor looking down through at a heart operation, looking at the chest of your patient. And so everything, even though it's to the left of you, this is the right side. I'll just put an R there if I can get my stylus to write today. And this is the left side of the heart. So inside the body, the right side of the heart would be on the right side of the person. But we can see the chambers. We can see these 2 upper chambers, the right and left atrium, and then these 2 lower chambers that are much more triangular in shape, the ventricles. And we'll be talking about how the blood moves through the heart on the next slide. We also see several large vessels that will be carrying the blood. We have a big vein here, which is not blue in real life, but that's how they always draw it on diagrams. The vein will be bringing the blood back to the heart. It's been traveling through the body and gotten rid of the oxygen and the nutrients, and so it's time to come back and get some more oxygen. And then we have a big red vessel. This is your aorta, the biggest blood vessel in the body. And if you were to make a fist, your fist is a little bit smaller. Your heart's a little bit bigger than your fist, but your fist is roughly the size of your heart. And if you stick your thumb out, that's roughly the size of the aorta. Of course, bigger people would have, bigger structures, but that gives you kind of a general idea. The aorta is the big vessel leaving the heart, carrying blood out to your body. And then this purple blood vessel in the front is the pulmonary artery. It's the one that goes to the lungs so that the blood can be oxygenated, so that oxygen can be added to it. And then the blood will return with these purple veins here in the back. So artery just means something that's moving away from the heart. And all of the arteries except this purple one, this pulmonary artery, would be carrying oxygenated blood. But of course, the artery that's carrying blood to the lungs, well, that's going to be carrying blood that needs oxygen. And so even though it's an artery, the blood in that is not high in oxygen. From this diagram, also notice how thick the wall of the heart is, especially over here in this left ventricle. This very thick muscle layer is needed to pump that blood out because it's going to be pushing the blood out to reach the farthest cells in your body. And each one of those pushes is the pulse. It's it's a bulge of blood being pushed out by the heart. The contents of this ventricle will be pushed out through the aorta. Your blood vessels can stretch a little bit, so they expand a little bit to take sort of a ball of blood. And that's, as that bulge travels through the blood vessels, that's what you actually feel under your fingers as a pulse. This sort of white stringy stuff here is the valve. This is the tricuspid valve on the right side, and then it's the mitral valve on the left. Those valves are flaps of tissue that actually will prevent blood from backflowing, so it cannot go from the ventricle back up to the atrium. This tissue will cover the opening. And, we're talking about a living thing. You're made out of tissue, and so even though we use the word valve, it's not a real strong, it's a sturdy structure. Most people, it lasts all their life. But it's not a real thick thing. It's a very, very thin structure, a little bit of tissue, but it does its job. The other set of important valves, you can see one of them here on the bottom of the pulmonary artery. It's a valve that's kind of shaped like a cup. It's called the semilunar valves because it's sort of rounded in shape. And they also prevent backflow. The blood can't go backwards down that artery. Once you've pushed blood into it, it has to keep going forwards. So here on the top. So this diagram talks about how blood travels through the heart. And so we see things coming in, and they use blue and red typically to depict blood that has oxygen or does not have oxygen. So blue blood is deoxygenated. It's low in oxygen, whereas red on these diagrams represents oxygenated blood. In real life, all of your blood is red, and I'll show you a picture a little bit later. So blood will come from the body. It travels into the heart from the veins, the vena cava, into the right atrium. Then it gets pushed down into the right ventricle, and the ventricle gives it a much bigger push to send it out to the lungs through the pulmonary artery. From the pulmonary artery, the blood would be going through blood vessels all the way down to capillaries, down in the alveoli, and becoming oxygenated, and then it comes back through a pulmonary vein, and it's red now because it's full of oxygen, into the left atrium, down to the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta. And the aorta very quickly divides to start sending blood up to your head and to your arms, and then as it curves around and heads down the body, it will hit all of the body parts that are below the heart. As your heart beats, you are first contracting the upper half, so it's divided kind of in half between the atrium and the ventricles. So the top half will contract and push blood into the ventricles, and then the bottom half will contract and push blood out of the heart, either going next door to the lungs or going out to the rest of the body. So this is showing that basically your blood is traveling through some loops. We call these the systemic and the pulmonary loop. From the heart again in the center of this diagram on the right, we see that we've got blood traveling out the pulmonary artery to the lungs to be oxygenated, and then around again to the pulmonary veins, and I just can't get this stylus to work today. There we go. Back to the left atrium and to the ventricle, and then from the ventricle we go out either to go to the head, maybe here on the top, or in arms or down below to the rest of the body. So we've got one set of circuit that's going out to the lungs and back, and then another circuit that's going around the body. You can see from this picture on the left, as I said, oxygenated blood is bright red, whereas deoxygenated blood is this dark red. And if you've ever given blood, you probably have seen this color in the test tubes because they are taking blood from your veins. Veins are closer to the surface, they are more visible. They're what you can kind of see through your skin sometimes, and that is where doctors or nurses are putting needles in to extract some blood. Arteries are more protected by your body, and they are deeper into your tissue. So your heart beats a certain number of times per minute, and that's known as your heart rate. And there are many things that affect this heart rate or this contraction of the heart. Your heart cells, if you remember when I was talking about the different types of muscle cells, heart cells will contract by themselves. They don't need a message from the brain to contract. So there's a natural pacemaker present in the cells themselves and in all those cells put together in the heart. But it's slower than you really would want, and so you do have a lot of input from your nervous system to increase or decrease your heart rate as your body needs it for homeostasis. So things that can change your heart rate are things like body temperature. If body temperature goes up, the heart rate tends to go up because you want to circulate the warm blood. Blood is going to be warm like your body is. And if you are circulating it through the skin, close to the outside environment, then there's a chance to radiate some of that heat off and to cool down the body. So heart rate will increase to push more blood through the skin in order to get rid of that heat. That's also why you kind of look red when you've been exercising or when your body temperature has gone up. The reverse is true. If your body temperature drops, your heart rate also will slow down so that you decrease the amount of blood that would be traveling close to the skin, and you decrease the chance of losing that important heat. As blood pressure changes, heart rate can change as well. So if blood pressure drops too low, the heart rate will go up to try to compensate for that. We might think that our heart rate goes up when we exercise because we need more oxygen, but actually it's the carbon dioxide level that our body is paying attention to. And when carbon dioxide gets too high, then it's assumed that you are low in oxygen, and that's what makes your heart rate go up, so that you're sending more blood to the lungs because your heart's beating more, and therefore you can get more oxygen in that blood and take it to your cells. Along with your nervous system, various hormones such as adrenaline can also change the heart rate. Adrenaline is something that will increase the heart rate. That's part of the hormone that's part of the fight or flight response, where you're worried about something or you're in a dangerous situation, sort of that feeling that you get. And so the hormones which are carried by the blood can also affect parts of the cardiovascular system. Blood vessels themselves are considered an organ in the cardiovascular system, and as I already mentioned, they form a closed circuit, so the blood never leaves the blood vessel, ideally. It just travels around and around. And as I said, your arteries are going to carry the blood from the heart. The capillaries are where all of the action happens. It's where the nutrients are exchanged, where waste is picked up, and then the veins carry the blood back to the heart. Now, actually, arteries refer to, kind of big blood vessels. We have a smaller sized one moving down. Before we get to capillaries, we also can talk about arterioles. So it actually goes arteries to arterioles to capillaries, and then going the other way from capillaries, we go to venules before we get to veins. But really, most people, if you aren't in the medical field, you just talk about arteries and veins. People don't talk about arterioles and venules. So as I already mentioned, the blood in the arteries has had this push from the heart. So the artery blood is in high pressure. And in fact, if you are ever unfortunate enough to get a deep enough cut that you open up an artery, or you are with somebody who has that happen, one of the signs that it's an artery that has been wounded and not just a vein is that the blood will spurt out. It'll go out with the heartbeat. You'll see a pulse of spurting blood because the blood in those arteries are under high pressure, even all the way down to the toes. As I said, you can take a pulse on a toe if you know where to feel it. So this bulge of blood from each contraction as it moves down through the blood vessels makes that push against your fingers that we call a pulse. But in contrast, after the blood has gone through the capillaries and it gets to the veins, it's very low pressure and it really doesn't have any push from the heart anymore. So to get the veins back to the heart, we use muscle contractions in the arms and the legs to help bring that blood up. So as the muscles are contracting, as you are moving, you are actually squeezing the blood in the veins back up to the heart. This is why if people stand for a long period of time, if they lock their knees, they have been known to faint. It often happens at weddings. I've seen it happen in a church service for somebody in choir, a rather large-sized man that I remember when I was a child, he fell over in the middle of a song. I think not a song, I think it was a prayer, sorry, because he was just standing there and he was not contracting his legs, and the veins were not, the blood in the veins were not being moved back to his heart, and so his blood pressure dropped a little bit. He didn't quite have enough blood flow back in, and so he fainted and ended up on the ground. He quickly recovered. It's a very common thing to have happen. This rabbit that you can see in this other picture is actually from a technique where the tissue is replaced by a plastic substance so this was an actual rabbit that then has been, the blood vessels have been plasticized, and we can see pretty much the whole outline of the rabbit, and that's because we're seeing all those capillaries. As I said, the capillaries touch nearly every single cell, so each of these places where there was a cell, there would be a capillary, and if we just took the capillaries and just showed just those capillaries, we are still going to see pretty much the form of the animal or whatever structure we're looking at, because there are just so many capillaries inside your body. The diagram on the right kind of shows some of the key blood vessels, but again, all of this space in this body would be filled in with capillaries. So the aorta, as I already mentioned, is that big artery coming out of the heart. It kind of takes a U-turn and heads down the body, and then will eventually split to either side for your two legs. After there's some branches going off from the top for your head and your arms. And then all the veins also collect back to a big vein, which is called the vena cava. So some of the other parts of the blood vessel systems, they're given names that refer to the different body sections. So we've talked about the thoracic cavity. We have a thoracic aorta, the part of the aorta that goes through the thoracic cavity. Renal refers to kidney, so the renal artery is going to be in the kidney. Abdominal aorta is going to be the part of the aorta in the abdomen. Gastric vein, there you go, that's going to be your digestive system. So if you ever do another class in biology and anatomy and physiology, we'll be talking about some of these words that are very common to certain parts of the body, and they help you identify where things are. So I'd already talked a little bit about how the blood vessels, the heart rate is related to body temperature, but I also wanted to point out that these blood vessels have muscles in them, so they can tighten or relax. So when they tighten, if we go over here on the right, if blood vessels constrict, it's called vasoconstriction, and if that happens, and we can see just an example, there would be a sphincter muscle here on this would be a small artery or arteriole going into these capillaries. So these small vessels next to the skin are the capillaries. And so the sphincter muscle, that circular muscle, would constrict and basically slow down the blood flow to the capillaries so that there'd be less blood flowing close to the skin and there would be heat conservation happening. Whereas on the left, we have a situation where blood vessels are dilating, so those muscles of the sphincter are relaxing so that the most amount of blood can flow through, and you can just see by the diameter difference of these capillaries how much more blood will be flowing there, which can increase the loss of heat or the release of heat into the environment and hopefully take the temperature down so that the person is going to be feeling more comfortable. So your blood vessels for homeostasis, there are muscles in the blood vessels that can adjust how much heat is given off to your environment to help you maintain the right temperature. And then last we get to blood. There's basically 4 parts to blood, and this diagram over here on the right would show if you took a little test tube of blood and you put it in a centrifuge, like a washing machine spin cycle, and you spun it down, you would have the 4 different layers here. We'd have the plasma, which is kind of a yellowy liquid on top, and you'd have the red blood cells on the bottom, and then in the middle you have your white blood cells and your platelets. And it gives you an idea what the proportions are. So going back to the facts over here, red blood cells are not quite half of the total blood volume, somewhere between 40 and 45%. But that's many, many cells in there. That's if you looked at, and we're going to look at a slide in the next picture, but if you looked at it, you're going to mostly see red blood cells if you're looking at a smear of blood. Red blood cells, like all blood cells, are made in bone marrow, and they last about 4 months. So they do get replaced. Your body's making billions of them on a regular basis. Then we have platelets, which are the smallest of all the blood cells. They're actually a piece of a bigger cell that sort of exploded to make them. And they're very important in stopping bleeding because they can get sticky and make clusters that will become a blood clot, along with some other proteins that are present in the blood cell, that are in the blood itself. They work together with the platelets. Those proteins and the platelets work together to form that clot. The white blood cells are immune cells, so they're not directly involved in transporting oxygen like red blood cells are, or doing things that seem to be more closely related to blood, like platelets that want to stop the blood. But the white blood cells are having various different roles in the immune system. We have neutrophils and macrophages and the T cells and the B cells. Some are maybe found in the blood itself, some are found in the lymph nodes, some of the white blood cells are found just moving through your body tissue itself. And then finally plasma, which is mostly water, but it's yellowish in color because there's a bunch of other stuff in there as well, some proteins, other nutrients, of course any kind of dissolved hormone or stuff, so that gives it that particular color. This is a microscope slide of a smear of blood, so it would just be a drop of blood, and so mostly what we're seeing are the red blood cells. So these little circles here, these are all red blood cells, and you can see how many they are. The little dots that you can see are the platelets, so they are very small. And then these various ones that are stained purple are different types of white blood cells. So this one over here would be a lymphocyte, it would be a B cell or a T cell. This one's probably a neutrophil. I don't think we have any. I think we have basically all neutrophils showing here. There are several other types that look more granular. It depends upon what kind of stain they were using, and I'm not sure from this diagram. So this just gives you an idea of, we're looking at a drop of blood. Really what you're seeing are red blood cells. That's what's giving it its color, because that is the component of the blood that is most dense. It's mostly red blood cells. So in summary, the cardiovascular system moves these needed substances around the body and then takes away the wastes. So it brings good things in and takes bad things away. Of course, it would take the wastes to wherever it needs to go. So carbon dioxide would go to the lungs to be breathed out, but urea and other substances that have to stay dissolved in liquid would head off to the kidneys to be removed through urine. The second point is that the heart is a muscular pump that does not get tired. Unlike your regular muscles, your skeletal muscles, which do get tired, your heart does not get tired, and we are very appreciative of that. Your blood vessels come in several sizes, but the capillaries are where the action happens. So in the capillary, it's called a capillary bed, where there's lots and lots of capillaries. That's where substances would actually be able to move in or out of the bloodstream. And then blood contains more than red blood cells. It also has the wound sealing cells of your platelets and the immune system fighters of the white blood cells, and everything floats in plasma. You can donate whole blood or plasma or platelets or just red blood cells if you're an adult. I think you guys are a little young. It takes about 24 hours for the volume of your blood to be restored from the water that you're taking in, but it takes several weeks to rebuild those cells that you've taken out. So usually they restrict you to giving donations to once every other month, so leaving about 8 weeks in between. But this is also another way that you can help by your own health to support the health of somebody else if you want to donate some blood.